I've been playing Elden Ring pretty much non-stop since its release, and I'm happy to say it is a brilliant game in so many ways. It continues to build on the incredible foundations first laid by Demon's Souls back in 2009, and is by far the bravest iteration on the series' formula so far. If I were to review it, I would have many glowing things to say about it. But as so often happens with very well reviewed, near universally applauded games during the first month or two after they hit store shelves, I can't help but feel like opinion has swung way too far towards the positive end of the spectrum when it comes to certain aspects of the game. And nowhere is this more evident than in the way a lot of people have been talking about Elden Ring's side quests, which I'm going to attempt to talk about without spoiling pretty much anything, as I know a lot of you watching will still be at varying points in your playthroughs. Hopefully what I have to say will resonate nonetheless. In short, while many of Elden Ring's side quests weave fairly interesting tales or feature twists and turns you simply do not see coming, developer From Software's unwillingness to in any way tweak the way they work in comparison to previous titles to account for the game's enormous scale is absolutely ridiculous. Yet a huge number of people, and especially those reviewing the game, seem to think that not only is that a good thing, but that it's also part of why Elden Ring is so much better than the vast majority of open world games released in recent years. There's been talk of other developers' complacency, of how refreshing it makes their game feel, of how cool it is that making notes outside the game to keep track of side quests is almost a necessity, and I couldn't disagree more. To understand why From Software has received something of a pass, or even praise in this regard, we first need to understand the direction open world design has taken in recent years, because it's not difficult to understand why so many are jaded when it comes to these types of games. I'm sure many of you out there are familiar with the issues: sprawling maps filled with hundreds of icons, many of which lead to quests or other tasks none too different from the other 30 you've already completed, complemented by a cluttered UI containing way too much information, as well as a seemingly never-ending quest log. Not all gamers will succumb to the urge to clear every inch of a map as they progress, but many, including myself, will for fear of missing something important. And what you end up with is an experience that begins to feel like a job, as you bounce from quest marker to quest marker without really engaging with the content provided. It's design which is repetitive, time-consuming, and, dare I say it, at times completely and utterly exhausting. The backlash against such formulaic design began some time ago, and many developers, Ubisoft in particular, have rightfully been called out for their cookie-cutter philosophy. But they're not the only culprits, and it's a problem even critically acclaimed open-world games have often suffered from. The Witcher 3 is, in my opinion, perhaps the best game of the last generation, but I'd nonetheless struggle to argue that it couldn't stand to be decluttered somewhat. For these reasons, the sense of open-world malaise so many were no doubt feeling prior to Elden Ring's release is completely understandable, and I believe it to be perhaps the defining factor in why the game has managed to avoid what is in some respects completely valid criticism. As is so often the case, when the scales tip, they tip too far, and in my view the joy of exploration has muddied the waters when it comes to the severe lack of accessibility evident in Elden Ring's side quests. It's also important that a clear distinction is made between those two terms. With regards to exploration and the joy of discovery so often felt off the back of it, Elden Ring is an invigorating experience. Unlike most modern open world games, FromSoft trusts you to go out and find adventure across the lands between without holding your hand, and no matter which area of the gigantic map you find yourself in, you're never too far from finding a hidden dungeon, meeting a new NPC, or encountering a terrifying new foe to vanquish. That feeling of freedom adds a whole new dimension to the sense of accomplishment which has always made the Soulsborne series so wonderful. In past games, much of it came from completing a tricky dungeon, reaching the end of a questline, or taking down bosses which at first seemed insurmountable, but now even the process of finding those things is rewarding in and of itself. Personally, I haven't had so much fun exploring an open world in a very, very long time. In terms of exploration then, I reckon Miyazaki and his team have pretty much knocked it out the park. It's when examining things in terms of accessibility, however, that my big issues with Elden Ring's side quests begin to become apparent, and I need to clarify here that when I refer to accessibility, I'm speaking in terms of overall game design, rather than how From has made the game more accessible for those with a disability. I am in no way qualified to speak about things in that regard. I must also include a caveat before we go any further. From Software have absolutely made changes to the Soulsborne formula to improve things from an accessibility perspective. Stakes of America, for example, remove the arduous runs back to bosses that could quickly become tiresome when multiple attempts at an encounter were required, and there are more opportunities than ever to tailor things towards your specific playstyle or desired difficulty level using new mechanics such as Ashes of War and Spirit Ashes, to name just a few. My problem is that the attention paid to these and other quality of life improvements designed to make your time spent in Elden Ring's open world as enjoyable as possible, do not manifest in any way, shape or form when it comes to the game's side quests. To say many of them are obtuse, I think would be rather kind, and that is a huge shame. What has always made the Soulsborne games so compelling, for me at least, is their combat, the associated challenge, and the fact that far more often than not, if you die, it's due to a mistake you made. Battling new enemies is as much a puzzle as it is a test of skill and reflexes, and if you pay at least a modicum of attention to what's happening during each attempt taking on a new area or enemy, you'll quickly learn how to succeed because of your errors, not in spite of them. That idea of being rewarded for paying attention to the little details, and sometimes the big ones, in order to succeed, is in many ways also equally applicable to those games' side quests. There were definitely those that few would manage to solve without consulting a guide or asking for help online, but because there were less of them and they were contained within smaller, generally more linear worlds, they never felt too outrageous. However, a world dramatically increased in scale combined with what seems like a lack of desire on FromSoft's part to introduce any improvements to how side quests are handled means that certainly isn't the case with Elden Ring. The game's side quests still feature all the hallmarks of a FromSoft developed title. What you actually need to do to complete them can often be unclear from the outset, the instructions you are given are usually cryptic, and many of them will contain multiple parts which are easy to miss once you've started them. That's if you don't miss starting them entirely. The problem is that as the scale of the Soulsborne experience has been magnified, so too have these quirks, and the lands between is far too large a place for them still to be tolerable. Revisiting areas with the hope of stumbling across the next part of a side quest isn't really a feasible long-term strategy, because frankly it would require an enormous time investment compared to previous games. Locating NPCs who have moved to another area as part of a quest, a FromSoft favourite, is often based more on luck than it is anything else, and it's not uncommon for them to move to areas you've already visited and are unlikely to return to. And finally, there are so many characters, items and locations included in Elden Ring, which in itself is no bad thing, that the process of figuring out exactly which you need to speak to, collect or visit in order to progress things can at times feel like too big an obstacle. Now, I am in no way suggesting that the game needs objective markers or a quest log that tells you exactly where to go and what to do in excruciating detail, nor do I think their complexity necessarily needs to be reduced to bring Elden Ring more in line with other open world experiences, but I do think there's a middle ground which FromSoft simply hasn't found. Open world games like those released by Ubisoft didn't start out as ridiculously streamlined as they are now. It was a somewhat gradual process that occurred over many games and multiple generations of consoles, and to some degree I think it did begin with good intentions, to prevent you from getting overwhelmed and to guide you towards the content included in each title. Yes, what they've become in the present is in my opinion way too much, but that doesn't mean there weren't still lessons to learn along the way. The major one perhaps being that those investing huge amount of hours into games as massive as these titles often are would like at least a minimal level of developer support so they can actually experience as much of the content on offer as possible. An extra page in the menu which keeps track of dialogue you've had with NPCs, or perhaps the option to keep a journal yourself within the game would be more than adequate in Elden Ring's case. Something, anything, to make completing so many of the game's side quests more manageable and less of a stab in the dark. I'd hazard a guess that the two biggest arguments against additions such as these, ones which would change so little but have such a huge effect on my, and I'm sure many others' enjoyment of Elden Ring, would be that you can still write things down yourself during a first playthrough, or use the internet for help during a second when you're happy discovering things less organically. The answer to the first is a simple one. Constantly having to stop and write down notes away from the game is immersion breaking, and if doing so is a requirement to experience much of what the game has to offer, then FromSoft absolutely should have designed a system which accounts for that. With regards to the second, I understand that many of you out there may play Elden Ring more than once, but there can be no argument that it is a gigantic game, and a lot of people are not going to have the time nor the inclination to do similar. If you have a spare 50 hours or more to go through the game a second time using outside help, that's great, but whether you like it or not, a huge percentage of the game's audience will move on to other titles upon completion, or simply may not have the time to go through everything again with a fine-tooth comb, even if they want to. And ultimately, everything I've just mentioned is why I touched briefly on the joy of discovery earlier in this video, because I think at times people have been conflating the two, stating that the side quests are part of this amazing journey of exploration, and that to include them in any other form would do nothing but detract from that. What I would say is that being able to find so many new and exciting things across the lands between is a very good thing, and that includes Elden Ring's NPCs and side quests. Other than the amazing combat we all know and love, it is where I think the game is at its strongest. However, there are without doubt accessibility issues in the way side quests are handled after their initial discovery, and this is the point where for many the idea of exploration will give way to feelings of frustration due to FromSoft's unwillingness to make even basic changes to account for the size of their new open world. Most of the side quests I've experienced during my time with Elden Ring I've really enjoyed, but as brilliant as many of them may be, I just wish FromSoft had made it a little easier to actually experience them all to their fullest. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and tarnished. If you enjoyed it, do consider subscribing to the channel and letting me know what you think. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this particular issue, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.